Welcome, everyone, to Splendid Wake 6. I am Henry Crawford, and I will be leading us today on a journey celebrating DC's poetic history and honoring its past and present seers and visionaries. The idea behind Splendid Wake is to memorialize the work of poets who have lived, worked, volunteered, or been active in a group in the DC metro area. Our goal is to ultimately celebrate the depth and breadth of DC's literary community. And so we have quite a show in front of us today, and it is a wonderful day for poetry, so let's get at it. But before doing that, let me welcome Jennifer King, who is the librarian here at the Gelman Library, George Washington University.
Hello. I'm wearing two hats today. First, I want to thank everyone for coming on behalf of the library. It's wonderful when we have public programming. We try to do this as much as possible, and we're thrilled to see this many people here on a Sunday afternoon. And then my other hat is I am the librarian who deals with collecting the history of Washington, D.C., which includes the D.C. poetry community. And that's how I got involved with the Splendid Wake. This is the 6th annual symposium, so that's an impressive run, and it's only getting better and better. If you have materials, if you have published works, anything that adds to the story that is the DC poetry community, find me, talk to me, and I'm happy to add to our collection. So I don't know what happens next. I leave.
The first presenter. Okay, let me introduce the first presenter. Our first presenter is Abdul Ali, who will be remembering Dolores Kendrick. Abdul is a faculty member at Howard University, where he teaches in the writing program. His book, Trouble Sleeping, was a 2014 winner of the New Issues Poetry Prize, and he is a two-time recipient of the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities Literature Fellowship. His work has appeared in several journals, including Gargoyle, A Gathering of Tribes, New Contrast, Poet Lore, and the Academy of American Poets. Abdul will be remembering Dolores Kendrick, who passed away in November of 2017 at the age of 90, and who was an active force in the District of Columbia literary community. So with that, let me give you Abdul Ali, remembering Dolores Kendrick.
I'm going to keep my remarks concise, the way I think Dolores would have liked it. But I'd like to start off by saying Dolores Kendrick was our second poet laureate after Sterling Brown. She was an elder. She was stylish, wearing raccoon furs at poetry readings, gowns, heels. She suffered no fools. She had a wry sense of humor. She was a friend. She was proud. She was enigmatic. She was a giant that counted Sterling Brown as one of her father's tennis partners, Gwendolyn Brooks as her mentor, Robert Hayden and James Baldwin as her BFFs. In so many ways, she was this rare gift. She had a program called Poets in Progress, which I was one of the later members and probably one of the younger members. And I often felt very much out of place, and intimidated. And, she always, before the reading, she would say, protect your vision, you'll be fine. And I'll always be grateful to her for that. But more than the official public connection, I will forever remember our going to lunch at Eatonville, when there was such a thing as Eatonville, the Mandarin Hotel, how she interacted with the wait staff. I remember she ordered tea, and the guy sort of just handed a bundle of tea and said, "Here, pick one." And she said, "Oh no, I've been to Germany, you do it," and so of course those lunches became very expensive because I had to kind of mouth, so it was quite an affair going out with Auntie Dolores. But the poetry readings were always an event. And sometimes I'd get a phone call near midnight. She said she kept vampire hours, so you don't call her during the day, but she'd call you, when you're nodding off or whatever, and she'd call and say, "Ali," and I said, "Yes, Dolores," and she'd say, "I think you might want to know that I'll be doing a reading," and it was always very, in her own way, that was her way of reaching out, and I really appreciated that. My first encounter with Dolores was as a student at Howard University. It was in my sophomore seminar course where we read a novel, a play, and a collection of poems. And in that particular course, Women of Plums was the collection that we read for that semester. Every year we'd have something called Hearts Day. Yes, it happened on Valentine's Day, and we'd honor one of the icons of African American literature. And that year, we honored Nikki Giovanni, Lucille Clifton, and Mari Evans, and Dolores was invited to introduce, I believe, Nikki Giovanni. And what struck me as odd on that evening was Dolores spent not so much time introducing Nikki Giovanni, but introducing herself. Like she wanted us to know that, you know, she was definitely a player, you know, in all this literary history that we were talking about that day. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that what it must have been like for a poet of Dolores' stature who came of age before the civil rights movement, and so much of the attention, you know, were kind of shown on many of the Black arts poets, and she was not a part of that. And so I'll never forget that. But to know Dolores is to know her work, and I'd like to share a few poems, if that's okay, with you this afternoon. Two short ones and a longer one. While Dolores is mostly known for Women of Plums, writing about sort of the horrors of slavery on the Black female body, this poem, Jenny in Love, always strikes me as, I don't know, one of the poems that I'd like to hear more of us talk about, sort of instead of focusing on the drama of slavery. I'll just read it. It's called Jenny in Love. Danced in the evening while the supper burned. Whooped in the morning, danced again. I love this poem because I think it shows all of the colors of the human condition. We don't often think of, you know, enslaved folks having moments of joy, and I thought that that poem captured that nicely. The other poem, of course, we know that Dolores was a teacher for over 40 years. 20 of those years was in DC public schools. The latter 20 was at the Philip Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. This poem, which I love, I'm going to share as much as I can with you. It's called Rooms. And anyone who knows Dolores knows that she was very deliberate about how she entered a room and how she exited. Rooms. 1. I don't know where it was. It was near, where all the rooms were clothed in ice and naked children walked beside me and asked for candy. That's not nourishment, I said. It was near. Their white bodies were hot with fevers. I took their temperatures and wondered if white flesh held heat longer than black. They wondered at my curiosity. I walk into the classroom with Baldwin, Brooks, Wright, and Hayden, their mastery of the universe, the strut of their language soft in my footprints. I am filled. And when I walk into the classroom, I close the closet door at the end of the room, look at the straight white teeth in the white mouths of the white faces before me, and pick up Shakespeare. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter is Kim Roberts, who will talk about the DC Jazz Age writers, including Langston Hughes, Zora, Neale, Hurston, and others. Kim is a poet with 5 books of poetry, most recently, The Scientific Method. Her presentation today will focus on her forthcoming book, A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C., which covers the city's early literary history from its founding in 1800 through the beginnings of modernism. Today, she'll be presenting her work on the Harlem Renaissance and Jazz Age writers in D.C. from that book. And the book itself will be released in June, and there's information, I believe, that has been passed out that will help you to locate that book. So let's hear from Kim Roberts.
This book tells the story of Washington, D.C.'s writers from the founding of the city in 1800 through the beginnings of modernism. I go till around 1930. It combines 4 neighborhood walking tours with brief portraits of individual writers of note. Some of these writers will be familiar to any well-read American. Many will, I hope, be new discoveries. I've organized the book into 5 chapters corresponding to 5 sometimes overlapping time periods that mark the eras of most ferment in the city's early literary communities. Chapter 1 has no walking tour, but all the other chapters combine a tour with portraits. The book also serves as an anthology with poems and prose excerpts from each featured author. Chapter 1, titled Beginnings, covers the period from the city's founding in 1800 through the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. In its nascent antebellum period, D.C. was a small town with few year-round residents and a seasonal influx of part-timers who swelled their ranks each winter when Congress was in session. But even in that early era, there was a sense of larger purpose, a shared feeling that the capital city could be a national model, and its broad avenues could symbolize democracy, although from the start, democracy was meted out unevenly. In the city's earliest years, prior to the Civil War, significant writers included Joel Barlow, a diplomat most famous for negotiating a treaty with Napoleon and the Treaty of Tripoli, Daniel Webster, renowned orator, congressman, senator, and Secretary of State, Francis Scott Key, who penned the lyrics to the national anthem, Paul Jennings, who wrote the first slave memoir about serving in the White House, Josiah Henson, author of 2 memoirs and the model for Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Michael G. Shiner, author of the first known memoir by a former slave who lived in D.C., and Anne Lynch Boda, a poet who served as personal secretary to Senator Henry Clay and later became the host of a renowned New York salon popular with the Transcendentalists. Chapter 2 covers the Civil War era from 1861 to 1865. The chapter starts with a walking tour of downtown, covering locations where Walt Whitman lived and worked. During the Civil War era, D.C. was the center of the war for the Union side. Walt Whitman came to the city to volunteer in the many war hospitals, as did other writers, Clara Barton, Louisa May Alcott, Amanda Aiken Stearns, Jane Stewart Woolsey. The city's population exploded. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1810, the population was slightly less than 15,500. By 1870, it had grown to 131,700. The expansion of the government brought such writers as John James Piatt, along with his more talented wife, Sarah Morgan Bryan Piatt, William Douglas O'Connor, John Burroughs, John Willis Menard, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, and John Hay, among others. Journalists who covered the war from D.C. included Lawrence A. Gobright, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, Howard Glendon, the pen name for the remarkable Laura Redden Searing, who was deaf, and George Alfred Townsend, better known as Gath. The Civil War marks D.C.'s transition from a small town to a major city. The 3 portraits that are part of Chapter 2 cover John Burroughs, who developed a particularly American form of nature essay and started his writing career in D.C., Solomon G. Brown, a poet born free in D.C. who was the first employee of African descent of the Smithsonian Institution, and Charlotte Fortin Grimke, a remarkable poet and essayist who was a renowned abolitionist and host of a weekly literary salon in her home. Chapter 3 covers the Reconstruction era from 1865 through 1878 and begins with a walking tour of LaDroit Park and the rise of D.C.'s African-American intelligentsia, prominently featuring the Dunbars. Even before the Civil War's end, D.C. began drawing a large African-American population whose intellectuals and writers centered around educational institutions such as Howard University, M Street High School, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and the American Negro Academy. This would yield one of the most prominent communities of intellectuals of color in the nation. Writers who lived in DC during Reconstruction make an eminent list: Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Keckley, Alexander Crummell, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Solomon G. Brown, Anna Julia Cooper, Kelly Miller, Mary Church Terrell, James Weldon Johnson, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and Paul Laurence Dunbar among them. Chapter 3 continues with portraits of two writers, Frederick Douglass and Frances Hodgson Burnett. Douglass is renowned for his influential memoirs and essays. He served as DC's Recorder of Deeds and later as Consul General to Haiti. His house is now preserved by the National Park Service. Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote over 40 books for adults, as well as plays, but she's best remembered today for her children's literature, particularly The Secret Garden and Little Lord Fauntleroy. She also hosted a salon in her home, then located in DuPont Circle, now razed. Chapter 4 covers the Gilded Age, from 1870 through about 1910. The chapter starts with a tour of Lafayette Square covering the life of Henry Adams, the grandson and great-grandson of U.S. presidents, who was renowned for his novels Esther and Democracy, and his memoir, The Education of Henry Adams. Chapter 4 continues with portraits of Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, and Eleanor Wiley. Twain lived in D.C. in 1867, working briefly as secretary to Senator William Morris Stewart of Nevada. He lived in a boarding house favored by journalists, where he terrorized his landlady, Virginia Wells. According to Senator Stewart, who also lived at that address, he would lurch around the halls, pretending to be intoxicated. He would burn the light in his bedroom all night. Pretty soon, he took to smoking cigars in bed and ruined her sheets with burn holes. Twain finished the manuscript of his book, The Innocents Abroad, while in D.C., and his experiences in D.C. directly inspired his next novel, The Gilded Age, a satire of the city's political and social life, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner. His label for the post-Civil War period has stuck. It describes the economic growth, widening divide between the rich and poor, and political corruption that are hallmarks of the era. Ambrose Bierce lived his last known 15 years in D.C., working as a correspondent for California newspapers. While in Washington, Bierce completed his Devil's Dictionary and his word usage compendium, Write It Right. Eleanor Wiley was raised in D.C. in a socially prominent family and scandalized the society world with her multiple marriages and affairs. She wrote 5 books of poems and 4 novels, and later moved to Greenwich Village, where she was poetry editor for Vanity Fair and a contributing editor for The New Republic. Chapter 5, the final chapter, covers the Jazz Age, the period from 1920 to 1930. This is the point where the book finally starts to overlap with the period that A Splendid Wake aims to document. The portraits in this chapter cover the 4 authors pictured here. As the city continued a rapid expansion through World War I and the Jazz Age, the number of writers grew as well, bringing to DC writers at the forefront of modernist movements. This list includes the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, Sinclair Lewis, who wrote 2 of his masterpieces here. We, of course, associate him with the Midwest, but he wrote Main Street while living in DC. And such luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance period as Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and Zora Neale Hurston. Chapter 5 starts with a Harlem Renaissance walking tour. Despite being named for a neighborhood in New York City, the arts movement, now known as the Harlem Renaissance, was actually centered in several cities. DC was one of the most significant places for what was known at the time as the New Negro Movement. You could even claim that Washington is actually where the movement was born. This walking tour focuses on the U Street neighborhood, where several prominent writers, musicians, and artists lived in close proximity. In the 1920s, Washington could boast an impressive number of institutions that served and hired African Americans, notably Howard University, the premier African American university, which Zora Neale Hurston called the capstone of Negro education in the world, The federal government, which hired African Americans for a variety of jobs considered both good-paying and prestigious, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and the M Street High School, now Paul Laurence Dunbar High, the top African American high school in the US. DC had the largest and most established population of middle-class African Americans from the turn of the century through the 1930s. Unlike in New York, most properties in the segregated neighborhoods in the middle of the city, Shaw, Cardozo, LeDroit Park, and Pleasant Plains, were actually owned by African Americans. Property was more affordable in DC than New York, both to own and to rent, making middle-class lifestyle more attainable here. The Harlem Renaissance arguably began with the 1925 publication of The New Negro, an anthology edited by DC resident Alain Locke. A Harvard graduate and the first Black recipient of a Rhodes Scholarship, Locke was the chair of the philosophy department at Howard and also the faculty advisor for the university's Literary Society and magazine. Langston Hughes lived in Washington, D.C. for a very short time, 1 year and 4 months. But during that time, and during that whole time, he was depressed and unsettled. He hated it here. Yet, that time, from 1924 to 1926, was extremely important in the poet's early development. While residing in D.C., Hughes won his first poetry competition, gave his first public readings. He got a contract for his first book of poems from Alfred A. Knopf in New York, and finished that book manuscript titled The Weary Blues, which he published in February 1926. He also wrote most of the poems that would appear in his second book, which has an unfortunate title, Fine Clothes to the Jew. He developed friendships with prominent writers and intellectuals such as Alain Locke and Carl Van Vechten, and also with numerous younger writers. More than anything else, however, Washington, D.C. was important to Hughes for how it solidified and deepened his commitment to the African American working class, which would influence his writing for the rest of his life. I'm running out of time, but I want to point out the rooftop gathering in the far left corner. That's Langston Hughes at the front, and behind him are Charles Johnson, Franklin Frazier, Rudolph Fisher, and Hubert Delaney. And then the three authors on the bottom row are Alain Locke, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and Angela Weld Grimke. These are some photos not included in the book, a program for Hughes's first ever public poetry reading, an early newspaper advertisement for Duke Ellington's band, notice jazz spelled with S's, and a brunch party in New York honoring Hughes. He's at the very left corner, he's partly cut off. And Charles Johnson is at the far right, little cut off. Jessie Redmond Fawcett is the third from the right, another important Harlem Renaissance writer who lived in D.C. The number of jobs Hughes managed to go through in his very short time in D.C. is evidence of his unsettled mind. He worked in a downtown restaurant shucking oysters, selling advertisements for the Washington Sentinel newspaper, as a laborer at a wet wash laundry, as an assistant to Dr. Carter Woodson at the Association for Negro Life and History, and as a busboy at a hotel restaurant. The walking tour covers places where Hughes lived, worked, and socialized. Many of the buildings are still standing, which is great because the other earlier tours in the book, that's not necessarily true. Writers and musicians who lived in the greater U Street neighborhood during this time and who Hughes would have personally known and who are featured in the tour include Georgia Douglas Johnson, Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Jean Toomer, Richard Bruce Nugent, Madame Lillian Avanti, and others. This is all I can handle in 15 minutes. I just want to say that I think the book is physically beautiful. It's got these specially drawn maps. It's got a lot of historical photos, and then also a lot of contemporary photos, which were all taken by Dan Vera. That I think they're stunning. Some of the research for the book was done here at the Gelman Library. I can highly recommend to you their resources here. And so many thanks to Jennifer King, Joanna Howard, Myra Scleroux, for everyone who has been involved with A Splendid Wake. I really appreciate your support and your encouragement over many years as I've been putting this together. My publisher would also want me to let you know that the book is already available for pre-order. It does come out in June.
Okay, well, thank you, Kim Roberts. And it looks like that 30 years paid off, doesn't it? Uh, we now come to A.B. Spellman, who will give us a tribute to poetry and jazz, hopefully with Z's this time, in the work of performance poets during the Black Arts Movement. A.B. Spellman is an author, poet, critic, lecturer, with a number of books including Art Tatum, a critical biography, The Beautiful Days, 4 Jazz Lives, and Things I Must Have Known. Mr. Spellman is active on numerous arts panels and consortiums in the District of Columbia and has been recognized for his service to jazz by the National Endowment for the Arts. Mr. Spellman will share with us a few poems and speak about poetry and jazz in the work of performance poets in the Black Arts Movement. A.B. Spellman.
I'm always impressed with myself when I hear myself introduced. As always, I have prepared for a 2-hour lecture, and I'm going to try my best to skim through it in 15 minutes. Okay, first of all, Langston Hughes was mentioned quite a bit by Kim, and he's a good place to begin the discussion of jazz and poetry because he was very much committed to jazz as a medium in itself and jazz as a force in literature. All of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance were very jealous of black culture. They had seen it corrupted on the stage for generations in the form of minstrelsy and other vaudevillian projections of cooning and blackface and all of that ugly stuff. And they wanted to do black culture in a way that was positive and showed its brilliance, its genius, and its strength. And so jazz and blues were seen as fundamental to black culture, and they made good use of it. The poem "The Weary Blues" was mentioned, and that was a good place to start. Langston Hughes wrote that poem in, I believe, 1926, perhaps it was 1925, and he did record it with jazz musicians, and performed it many times with jazz musicians. There are good examples of this on YouTube, and of well-integrated, well-rehearsed performances of the Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. Jazz, of course, was a universal force from the 1920s all the way up through the 1930s in the rise of Nazism. It took Europe by storm, and there were actually collaborations between at least one jazz pianist and the most prominent modernist poets to be found in Paris at the time, people of the caliber of James Joyce, Walter Lowenfels, and others, and the black sheep of the Cunard steamship line, Nancy Cunard, an early sort of proto-feminist. And I wish I could find this book that was produced. Man Ray did the cover. These were songs. Joyce's poem was called To His Sleepy Whore, or something typically Joycean. At any rate, that's sort of irrelevant, but I find it interesting. Okay, moving on by also starting in the 1920s, other poets following Langston Hughes got very involved with jazz and poetry. Kenneth Rexroth, for one, started working with jazz musicians and even had a band that he thought, as he called it, the wonderful mad, what's his name, Maxwell Bodenheim, also did that. Robert Bly came in on the movement a little bit later. And Rexroth also sort of, in his mentorship of the poets of the so-called beat generation, sort of got them into reading with jazz, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and others. Kenneth Patchen, an early influence on me, was very much involved in reading. Of course, the poetry and music is an old tradition all the way. You can go to the troubadours and the bards if you want. You can go all the way up to Stravinsky and Persephone. But in jazz, poetry with jazz had to do as much with process, with projection, with introducing performance elements on the poet, him or herself, as anything else. And the Black Arts Movement saw a great deal of this. Amiri Baraka, the person who was most influential during the Black Arts Movement and an early mentor to me, broke through with a lot of performances that were well recorded and distributed with jazz musicians. Poets of this time, me for one, were always envious of musicians because they did not have to deal. They worked in another dimension. They had the element of time. We were writing contemplative poetry before that, which of course time was not a factor, and so we always wished that we had that moment of being able to say, just to be able to stand somewhere and blow, and that's what the Black Arts Movement tried to do. Baraka worked a lot with jazz musicians, a lot with the trombonist, the avant-garde trombonist Craig Harris, who would later be a partner with the great Sekou Sundiata. We had, the last poets tried to make jazz words, tried to make their poetry into jazz. That they were a very, very popular group. Jane Cortez traveled with a jazz band, and her performances were extremely well integrated with the music. This went on for a long time, and it was the way she was probably most often presented. There was a poet in Chicago who may not be known to many of you because, except for one little chapbook, which I do happen to have, called The Coming of John, he has no collections of poetry. His name was Amos Moore, and he was a person who was, I think, the best I've ever heard at capturing a jazz sensibility in a solo performance. If you ever can come across some of his work, try to get it because he was a really great poet. There was one recording on which he appears, an anthology sort of a production by Amiri Baraka. And what else? There was a guy in New York named Ronald Stone. If you ever saw he did put out a little chapbook, and if you saw it, you would say, this is a terrible poet. But the thing about him was that these were really like lead sheets for performances. He would work with Sun Ra on Sun Ra's Monday night gigs at Slugs, and he would sort of dance the poems, and he would improvise on the lines, and it was a really powerful kind of performance. His name was Ronald Stone, as I said. I don't know what you can do with that. I don't think it was ever recorded anywhere, and if that chapbook shows up, as I say, it's terrible. But you had to be there. You had to be there. And then in D.C., Sekou Sundiata, I should mention him. He died a couple of years ago. He was a very, very, very strong writer, a man who, first of all, I admire for being able to memorize like a 2 hours worth of literature and stand and project it with great confidence and skill. He had a lot of different shows that he did. They were all brilliant. He wrote several plays, many of which encompassed music, and he died much too soon. He worked with Craig Harris as well. In D.C., I wasn't in D.C. during these years, during the Black Arts years, so I don't know the other poets except for Gaston Neale. Gaston was the ubiquitous poet. He would have been here today. He went to as many things as Grace Cavalieri. and he would stand up at a moment's notice and do his poetry. His poetry, too, was different in performance from the one little chapbook that he published. When he was with musicians, the lines got repeated, the cadences were pulled out of the lines and emphasized. They, again, integrated into the music. And that is the whole, the good jazz with poetry, the brilliant jazz with poetry is the best integrated, the one which is best rehearsed, where the musicians and the poets know each other well and know what's coming and can play against it and can pull things out of each other. All right, you said you wanted poems? I didn't bring any. There are a few that I have committed to memory, so I'll do a couple of my hits. The first one is a poem about aging. It is called, oh, thank you so much. See, this is a person who deserves everything. This is things I must have known, my collection from Coffee House Press. All right. I do hope to have a new collection coming out this year. The manuscript is in. I have not heard back, and it includes a libretto, which I've been working on, and I'm trying to find a composer for. Libretto on the Great Migration. And it also includes some new directions, a suite of poems about Van Gogh, of all people. All right, from things I must have known. First poem is called Groovin' Low. It's the bebop lovers in the audience will recognize this as a play on a title of a tune by Dizzy Gillespie called Groovin' High. And whatever Dizzy Gillespie was talking about in that tune, I'm talking about getting older. All right. My swing is more mellow these days, not the hard bop drive I used to roll, but more of a cool foxtrot. I've learned to boogie with my feet on the floor. My eyes still closed when the rhythm locks. I'm still moving, still grooving, still falling in love. I bop to the bass line now. The trap set paradiddles, radamarcues, and flams that used to get me off still send me out, but I bop to the bass line now. I enter the tune from the bottom up and let trumpet and sax wheel above me. So, don't look for me in the treble. Don't look for me in the fly staccato splatter of the hot young horn. No. You'll find me in the nuance, hanging out in inflection and slur. I'm the one executing the half-bent dip and the slow, slow drag with the smug little smile and the really cool shades. All right, thank you. And one more. And that is all. I'm trying to be good. It's called After Vallejo. You all know Cesar Vallejo, I'm sure. It's almost surrealist poet who died, I think, about 1928, I think it was. After Vallejo. I will die in Havana in a hurricane. It will be morning. I'll be facing southwest, away from the storm, away from the coast, away from home, looking toward the virid hills of Matanzas where the Orisha rise, lifted by congueros and masks of iron, bongoceros in masks of water, timbaleros in masks of fire, by all the clave that binds the rhythms of this world. I'll be writing when I go, revising another hopeful survey of my life. I will die of nothing that I did, but of all that I did not do. I promised myself a better self than I could make, and I will not forgive. You will be there, complaining that I never saved you, that I left you where you live, stranded in your own green dream. When you come for me, come singing. No dirge, but scat my eulogy in bebop code. Sing that I died among gods and lived with no God and did not suffer for it. Find one true poem that I made and sing it to my shade as it fades into the wind. Sing it presto in 4/4 time the universal ghetto key of B flat. I will die in Havana in rhythm. Tumbayo, Montuno, Guaguanco, dense strata of rhythm pulsing me away. And the mother of waters will say to the saint of crossroads, well, damn, he danced his way out after all. Thank you.
All right. As I said, we're going to be doing we're going to move now to new forms of poetry, and our first presenter is going to be Truth Thomas, who will show us the power of poetic brevity in the fixed form framework of the skinny. Truth Thomas, like many of our presenters, wears several hats as an award-winning singer and songwriter, poet. He is the poetry editor of the journal titled Basin Review, the editor-in-chief of the Skinny Poetry Journal. He is the author of several books, including Party of Black, A Day of Presence, Bottle of Life, and My TV is Not the Boss of Me. His poems have appeared in over 100 publications, including the 100 Best African American Poems. His is an original voice concerned with the often troubling human condition. As a creator of the skinny form, Truth Thomas will discuss the power of poetic brevity, rules, rich refrains, and imagery that abide in this fixed form framework. So without more, let me give you the truth. Truth Thomas.
First, put your hands together for a presto 4/4 time, just for that line. One of the things I'm struck by is the continuum of great writers in D.C. that we're a part of, we're blessed to be a part of, and what big shoes we have to fill and follow. So it's a great honor to be a poet here. It's a great honor to be here in the company of great poets. I think you have a sheet that outlines the skinny form rules. About over 10 years ago or so, I think it was, I was in a poetry workshop at Howard University. Okay. Okay, I want to be heard. Can you hear me now? All right. About, I think 13 years ago or so, I was in a poetry workshop with Tony Medina, Dr. Tony Medina at Howard University. And it really inspired and moved me. He introduced me to a lot of forms. And it was a result of that workshop that I was blessed to create the skinny poetry form. And it's an 11-line form that has many elements of call and response, which was why we had Corey Henry, a great musician, and Nick Simrod playing earlier, because I want you to keep that in mind. Everybody know what call and response is? Who's it? Everybody say yeah? 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 Yeah. Okay, see, so some people been to church. All right, all right. A skinny is a short poem that consists of 11 lines. The first and 11th lines can be any length, although shorter lines are favored. The 11th and last line must be repeated using the same words from the first and opening line. However, they can be rearranged and different forms of the words can be employed. The second, 6th, and 10th lines must be identical. All of the lines in this form, except for the first and last lines, must be comprised of only one word. The skinny was, of course, created by me. And see, that's where I should have stopped reading and just looked back up at y'all, but I'm going to do that now. All right. I thought about the best way to present this, right? And I could read a lot of poems that I wrote in this form, but one of the things that has really impressed me over the past year, which has been, I think, the most busy year in terms of publishing for the journal, is the work that other people have submitted. Because the journal has become a sounding board for the hurt that many Americans feel given what's transpired in our country. So I'm just going to begin to read their poems, all right? This first one is by Brian Gilmore. Anybody know who Brian Gilmore is? All right. Put your hands together for Brian. All right. This poem is called Mass Incarceration and Extended Skinny. 1. Our world has always been jail, work, home, travels, jail. Deny, access, exclude, jail has always been our world. 2. These separate lives, us and them, mostly us, over here hating us, separate these lives. 3. This design of wickedness, see it, everyone. Look, see, they're here. Multitudes, see this design of wickedness. 4. Must we continue to suffer this? We cannot believe this. Who would allow this to continue? We must suffer. 5. Even in the schools, we are prisoners. Our essence unmentioned, prisoners, wondering of us prisoners. We are even in the schools. 6. Got jail bars on all the houses. Fear rules the streets. Fear erodes our spaces. Fear got jail bars on all the houses. 7. You cannot cross red lines, tracks, walls, borders. Red lines suffocating are these red lines you cannot cross. 8. We became at last free, at least legally. Free like dogs dashing, free we became at last. 9. So new prisons were built. Necessary evils, they say, necessary like green hair, necessary, so new prisons were built. 10. Finally released from them jails, boys are now men, boys of angry time, boys finally released from them jails. 11. For Dwayne Betts. The new Jim Crow bastards of the Reagan bastards of the Clinton bastards, the new Jim Crow. 12. Man must mean something to rise. Build, illuminate, dazzle, rise, magically from destruction, rise. Man means something to someone. 13. Freedom is a deeper memory. Stories of maroons, revolts, stories unspoken like family stories. Deeper freedom is a memory. 14. Makes me want to go like Norman Bates, psychotic. Adore peace, psychotic. When peace eludes, psychotic like Norman Bates, make me want to go. 15. We can all get along. Rodney, no one heard Rodney. No one respects Rodney. Can we all get along? 16. Overcoming is the persistent of continua aluta. Forward like always aluta. Keep on pushing aluta. Continua is the persistent of overcoming. As Brian Gilmore Young. Another reason I'm happy to be here is I think this is probably the closest I'm going to get to the White House. Not that I'm running, but I doubt that I'm going to be invited to read these poems. Were that to happen, I'm sure they'd be called fake poetry. A lot of folks have been writing in, submitting poems about you know who, so I'm just going to read them. The Donald Solution by Devin Josephs. Hitler has a comb-over, and in his mouth the dragon lives. Elected roars, firing hatred. Elected breath, exhaling Holocaust. Elected dragon has a comb-over, and a Hitler lives in his mouth. Orange is the New White by Jeffrey Lamar Coleman. I think I'll read that again. Orange is the New White. Call and response, right? Okay. Beneath the orange facade, you can see the whiteness of his bitterness. Whiteness swastikaing our otherness. Whiteness beneath the orange, you can see the facade. The Myth of Skinny Donald Trump by Sharon Mishler Fox. Y'all know Sharon? See, yeah, good. Donald Trump spreads lies like butter. Lies drape across landscape. Lies slither into crevices. Lies, lies, Donald Trump spreads like butter. Trump dines on lies. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, lies, every tasteless snack, lies. Trump dines on lies. This is the skinny on Donald Trump. Lies make Trump skinny. Lies, meaningless, skin bones, lies. The skinny on this is Donald Trump. Sharon Mishler Fox. One of the things I'm sure you may have also noticed, in addition to the alarm going off, is how injustice has become normalized over the past year in America to an alarming extent. This poem is by Serena Tien, and she calls it Strangers at Home. Tourists are not immigrants, strangers trying airport lights, strangers exhausted, constellations severing strangers. Immigrants are not tourists. And a poem by Clara Ray Rusnick Klein. In the airport security line, they frown, staring, whispering, Ahmed sighs, staring back, head high, staring, they frown in line, the airport security. Survivor. Grandpa shivers, remembering trains, showers, bodies, smoke rising from ovens, smoke instead of people, smoke, remembering trains, showers, bodies, Grandpa shivers. And in the middle of all of that, people still find time to love, which I think is marvelous. The Skinny on Italian Lovers by Thomas Lo Cicero. In the night, Italian lovers affettuoso, adagiato, andantino, allegretto, affettuoso, allegro, allegrissimo, accelerando, affettuoso, Italian lovers in the night. Dreamweaver by Karen Bovmeyer. I believe you can get me through the night. You know, I just like to say that to somebody one time. Dreamweaver, I believe you can get me through the night. Touch, skin, lick, lips, touch, sweat, slick, tears, touch. Believe me, I can get you through the night. That inspires me because of everything that we've been through. We're still human, and we still love. And as my time winds down, I'd like to encourage you to continue to love. That is a powerful weapon against. It sounds cliche, but I think it's an eternal one. When you're fighting back, fight with love. Fight nonviolently. I want to thank you again for having me, and please submit to the journal. It's just an honor to be here. I want to say how happy I am to see my brother Ali, to hear you for the first time, to also meet Sister Maritza Rivera, who has inspired and taught so many great poets. I love everybody. And thank you, Henry. Thank you very much for everything. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Truth Thomas. Okay, so that was the Skinny. Now we'll go over and we'll do another new form. And this is going to be Blackjack Poetry with Maritza Rivera, who will teach us the invention of Blackjack poetry. Maritza is a Puerto Rican poet and the author of About You, A Mother's War, Baker's Dozen, and 21 Blackjack poems. As an Army veteran, Maritza participates in the Warrior Poetry Project at Walter Reed and has served on the board of directors of Split This Rock. So let us go into that casino And let us have Maritza deal out a hand of Blackjack poetry.
Thank you so much for having me here. This is such an amazing program. Thanks to all of the organizers. This has really been fantastic. And it's an honor and a privilege for me to be here as well. The history of Blackjack poetry is very brief, like the form. The form is 3 lines, 7 syllables each. It totals 21. And if you were in a casino, that would be audience, call and response. That would be all right. I never set out to create a form. I don't know about you, Truth, but it wasn't an accident either. I was a corporate trainer way back when, and I had the privilege of traveling to Reno like every 3 weeks for a little over a year. Every 3 weeks I was in Reno. So, of course, you get to the airport and you hear, the slot machines. You go to the gas station, there are slot machines. You go to the supermarket and there are slot machines. I'm from Puerto Rico. I grew up with casinos. A casino to me was you'd go out to dinner, you'd go dancing, and then you wander through the casino, and that's the end of your evening. But in Reno, it was completely different. People were there from breakfast, lunch, dinner, and to get dinner, you had to walk through the casino because there's no way to get food without going through the casino. So I don't gamble. And I had a lot of time on my hands. So my go-to form in terms of a poetry exercise was always the haiku. I found it really challenging, and it just kept me writing. But I needed something more for the many hours. And so I decided, if necessity was the mother of invention, then boredom was the father of creativity, because I was bored out of my mind. So, like I said, I did not set out to create a poetic form. I had used haiku. I really didn't like writing in form, and I've checked off a villanelle. I've checked off sestina, a pantoum. After this year's retreat, I think I'll check off a sonnet because we're going to have a class on a sonnet. But 3 7-syllable lines was manageable for me, and it sounds like it's easy, but it is very challenging. So here I was in my own head doing this for a few years, and I went to Brazil in 2012 with a group of international writers. It was a phenomenal time, and I kind of let everybody know that I was doing this. And there were people from Brazil, from Canada, from the US, and they thought it was the neatest thing. And I said, well, okay. Chris Quarterly is a Canadian poet, and he said, well, the Blackjack fits English better. And it's like, well, if you think about the breath in the haiku and a breath in a Blackjack, I think English fits a little bit better. But I also write in Spanish, and I know that it also fits in Spanish. So that's how it came about. And after the fellowship in Brazil, I opened up a group, a Blackjack Poets group on Facebook, and it took off. There are hundreds of poets writing in that form now, and I think it's over 300 some odd poets are writing in that form from all over the place, and it's gained a little popularity, and I have to do shout-outs now. I have to do a shout-out to David Taylor Nielsen, who I call a master Blackjack poet because he loves this form, and he's written hundreds of poems in Blackjack form. He also runs a poetry series at the New Deal Cafe, and he features Blackjack poetry at this poetry series that I had never gone to until like 2 years ago, because I had to go, because I kept promising I'd go, and I finally did. I have to shout out to Kwame Alexander, because without Kwame, I would not have gone to that fellowship. And Kwame Alexander featured 33 Blackjack poems in his recent novel, Booked. So if you have Kwame's book, Booked, you will see 33 Blackjack poems in that. Another shout out is to Lee Hinton. He teaches the Blackjack form in Pennsylvania. Lucinda Marshall, who runs the diverse poetry reading in Gaithersburg, she uses Blackjack with her youth writers group. So, so why do we need a new poetic form? Aren't villanelles and sestinas and enough? Why? I mean, do we need? I think it was a challenge for me. It just kept me writing and doing new things, and it also helped me follow up what I do. I sometimes publish poetry in non-traditional ways, and that's what you have in your hands, those cards. Instead of publishing a book, I made a deck of cards, and my hook to the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County was that this would put poetry in everyone's hands. And so they bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Now we come back to, I love him as a writer. I love him as a teacher, Ed Hirsch. And he published a dictionary of poetic forms a couple of years ago. And you cannot find a skinny or a blackjack in that publication yet. So that yet depends on all of us to use these forms, celebrate these forms, and make them, standard form of poetry that'll maybe someday replace the haiku in third grade or third to fifth grade poetry classes. I want to give you some examples other than the ones that are going around in the poetry cards. I have found Blackjack poem. Write poetry, for God's sake, for it's the only thing that matters, said E. Cummings. So, the first Blackjack ever written in Reno, Cafe Olé. The aroma of coffee filters in from the kitchen, brewing fresh grounds for divorce. So you can play with these. A lot of times when I read poetry, I always dedicate it to my ancestors, because without them, I would not be here. And one of the Blackjack poems that I've written over the years was for the youngest of my two brothers, who was very sick. Was in a suburban hospital. I loved them for what they did for him. He was in Montgomery Hospice, and they treated him like royalty. And this is how I honor him and his life. My earth angel sprouted wings to join our ancestors. We held hands for the last time. So you can, as you can see, I've read a couple of different Blackjack poems that range in theme. These are very, very adaptable. They're short. Some of them pack a punch. I'm going to end with a Blackjack poem, but I also want to give you a couple of other examples. This is, I listen to too much NPR. I've always said that. I can answer the wait, wait, don't tell me questions. And this Blackjack poem came from an NPR report. A lot of Blackjack poems do not have a title, but this one does. David Taylor Nielsen, that I mentioned before, he and I have been arguing all these years. He does not like titles like haiku, and I do like titles, so it's my form. I can do anything I want. So this haiku was this slip of the tongue. This Blackjack is called Mirrors. True story. The forced tattoo she wears bears the name of her abuser, her image a reminder. I've worked in domestic abuse, and that's a topic of a poem that you normally don't hear. So NPR can be a source of poetry. This one was dedicated to to a 50th birthday of a friend. It's called Icing. Watching birthday candles melt, I wish I were cake, feeling the warmth of wax on my skin. Ooh. So I have fun. I have fun with these, and hopefully you'll embrace them as I have. And the last Blackjack poem I will read in closing is called Thriller. Every day I turn a page, read a chapter of my life, hope for a happy ending. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a quick announcement and request. Some of you are already aware about an open letter to the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities regarding the selection of the next DC Poet Laureate. Kyle Dargan and I have been working together on advocacy around the selection of the next DC Poet Laureate. We are advocating for the transparency of and public engagement in the selection process, and also input into the job description. We have sent an open letter to the DC Commission Executive Director and all the arts commissioners, and many of you have signed the letter already, so thank you. If you're not aware of the letter, I brought copies today. They're out front, right outside the door on the table. And you can also find the letter posted online at postnoills.com. All this is on the flyer outside. So we need more people to sign the letter. It's critical right now to show that there's a strong community of poets and artists that are engaged and concerned about this issue. We need the DC Commission to be transparent about the selection process, its practice, its plans, and not just transparency. We're not just looking for information, we're looking for authentic community engagement. We are strongly recommending that at least half of the review committee that's going to be selecting the poet laureate be comprised of members of this community who have a history and wealth of knowledge about poetry in DC. So if you want to add your name, there are instructions on how to do so. Basically, you can just email Kyle Dargan at postnoills@gmail.com. And then you just send him your name, your city, state. You don't have to be a DC resident. Obviously, we want DC residents, but you can be a DMV poetry lover, and just state your, include your relevant affiliation to poetry in DC. So thank you. If you have questions, contact me or Kyle.
Okay, I would like to thank Jen King, because Jen is the person here who gets constant emails from me throughout the year, whether it's our meetings or whether it's setting things up in a specific way for a specific speaker. whether it's something having to do with the wiki. Jen is here, and Jen always finds the answer, and we love her. So there you go. So let's give her a round of applause, please.
Joanna Howard, who has taken over the responsibility for this effort of ours, which I think is terribly important. I don't want to forget Sterling and all those who I got to know and who were remarkable people who changed the life in this, not just in Washington, but in our world, in our country. So Joanna, thank you very much. There's a lot we're
Keep it going. Joanna was just a marvel to work with. This is my first year on the committee, and you made life very pleasant for me, and you worked very hard. And I just wanted to thank you. You are a force here in D.C. for putting this show on every year, and just thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you to our brave timekeepers.
Oh, yes.
Mention the wiki.
Okay, great in that direction.
And I want to thank our wonderful speakers today. It's been absolutely thrilling. Thank you. Thank you. Where's Maritza?
Okay. I'm going to close by first thanking our video company, C Video. And I'm going to be posting that once we get the edited version. I'll be posting that up on our YouTube channel. And that I will also post on our Facebook place, on Twitter, and on the blog. I'd like to thank Jacqueline Jules for all the work she does year in, year out, keeping our blog going. As you know, starting in the summertime, we do our pop-up poetry event on the blog, and each day a different poet, whether you are on the committee or a presenter or somewhere in between, we feature you in one of your poems, and she is responsible for that. And I'd also like to mention, as Kim was pointing out, that we have our wiki, and the wiki is where all of the online research goes. And if you open up your booklet, you'll see that it's on the welcome page. It's really, it's a rich listing of poets, poetry movements, and so forth. It's also something that we need everyone's help to sustain. If you have time to write, if you have time to edit, if you have anything that you want to add, please contact Jennifer King, Jen King at gwu.edu, or me, or anyone that you know on the committee. We're always looking for interns, and if you have graduate students or undergraduates who are looking to earn some credit or get some experience, please contact me. Our blog, we also have our blog, address right here. And in the end, what I want to say is, if you look on the back page, I'm a teacher, so the 2018 Splendid Wake Committee, these are the people who really brought it all together. It takes so much work to do something and be successful, and we have been very successful this afternoon, but excuse me, it takes people willing to come in and contact writers to do the work. Henry and I and Karen worked on this program this year. Henry did a beautiful job, I think. We've got people who are here, people who are not here, who, whether it's a few suggestions or something that needs to be done or networking with someone, these are the people who do the hard work of this program. So let's give them a round of applause. And that's all I have to say.